"This is a fake," she said quietly, and the room went still in a way that didn't belong to someone wearing a waitress badge. The air inside the private conference suite on the 32nd floor felt heavier than it should have, thick with polished ambition and expensive cologne, the kind that clung to tailored suits and whispered power without ever raising its voice. And yet somehow it was the faint scent of lemon cleaner from the service hallway that lingered closest to Ava Carter's skin as she stood near the far wall, a silver tray balanced steady in her hands, her reflection faintly trembling across the mirrored surface of the marble table where men worth more than entire cities leaned forward, pens poised, waiting for a signature that would move $200 million like it was nothing more than a number on a screen, and she wasn't supposed to be part of that moment. Not even close, just a shadow in motion, trained to step in, pour water, step out, and disappear before anyone thought to notice the color of her uniform or the quiet precision of her steps. But she had noticed them, every word, every shift in tone, every pause that didn't quite make sense. And when Sheikh Khalid al-Mansour lifted his pen, the gold trim catching the chandelier light in a sharp glint that cut across the room, something inside her refused to stay silent. Something older than fear, sharper than caution, and before she could talk herself out of it, before the rules drilled into her by supervisors and survival alike could pull her back, the words left her mouth, calm, steady, impossible to ignore. "This is a fake." And for a fraction of a second no one reacted, like the room itself needed time to process that the interruption had come not from the legal team, not from the executives seated in Italian leather chairs, but from the woman standing beside a cart of bottled water. And then the silence snapped tight, heads turning in perfect, synchronized disbelief, a low chuckle slipping from somewhere near the end of the table, quickly followed by another, softer, more controlled, the kind of laughter that didn't need volume to carry judgment, and Ava felt the weight of it press against her chest, but her hands didn't shake, not even as the tray reflected the sharp line of Sheikh Khalid's gaze shifting toward her, dark, assessing, unreadable, his pen still hovering midair, frozen between decision and doubt, while Daniel Brooks leaned back in his chair with a slow, amused exhale, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to suggest he had already dismissed her without needing to ask a single question. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone smooth, polished, the kind that had closed deals across continents. "Did the staff just interrupt a multi-million-dollar negotiation?" Few of the executives smiled at that, not broadly, not openly, just enough to signal alignment. And someone near the door muttered something about security, the word floating through the room like a quiet command waiting to be obeyed. But Ava didn't move, her eyes fixed not on Daniel, not on the men who were already deciding her place, but on the documents spread across the table, the page edges perfectly aligned, the clauses buried in dense legal language that most people in the room trusted someone else to fully understand, except she had read it, every line, every comma, earlier that morning when it had been left unattended near the service station, and the memory of it sat clear and unshaken in her mind, a pattern that didn't belong, a shift in liability that hid behind polished wording, and when she spoke again, her voice didn't rise, didn't push, it simply cut through the noise with quiet certainty. "Clause 17, she said, and this time the laughter didn't come. "It transfers full liability to your side after execution." And for the first time the Sheikh's expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to comment, but enough for the air to tighten, his pen lowering just a fraction, while Daniel's smile held, but thinner now, stretched at the edges like something under pressure. "That's not correct," he replied, quicker than before, just a touch too quick. And Ava felt her heartbeat once, hard and steady, the sound of it louder than the hum of the air conditioning above them, louder than the faint clink of glass as someone set their water down, and she knew she had already crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed, the one that separated invisible from seen, safe from exposed, and still she didn't step back, because somewhere beneath the weight of their stares, beneath the quiet threat of being escorted out, there was something else holding her in place, something simple and unshakable, the knowledge that if he signed that paper, everything that followed would be built on a lie. And for the first time since she entered the room, Sheikh Khalid spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying authority without effort. "Explain," he said, Not to the men seated at the table, not to the legal team, but to her. And just like that, the balance in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a breath being held just a second too long, waiting to see if the quietest voice in the room had just changed everything. No one moved at first, not even the men who had already decided she did not belong there, because the weight of Sheikh Khalid's single word settled over the table like a command no one dared interrupt, and Ava felt it as clearly as if it had been placed directly on her shoulders, the expectation, the risk, the narrow line she was standing on, and for a brief moment the room seemed louder in its silence. The low hum of the ventilation system, the faint ticking of a watch somewhere down the table, the soft creak of leather as someone shifted uncomfortably, all of it pressing in as she set the silver tray down on the service cart with deliberate care, the quiet click of metal against glass sounding sharper than it should have, her hands finally free, her fingers steady as she stepped forward just enough to see the document clearly, without crossing into the invisible boundary that separated staff from decision-makers. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision, not louder, not forceful, just certain. The clause is written to look like a standard compliance adjustment, but it is not, she said, her eyes tracing the lines she had memorized hours earlier. It shifts all post-execution liability to your holding company if any regulatory issue appears after the deal closes. And she could feel the shift ripple across the room, subtle but undeniable, a tightening of posture, a pause in breath, while Daniel Brooks leaned forward now, elbows resting on the table, his expression controlled but no longer amused. "That is a misinterpretation," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "It is a common safeguard in international agreements." And Ava did not look at him when she answered, because she knew exactly what he was trying to do. Pull the focus away from the contract and back onto her. Reduce her to the role they were more comfortable with. "It is not a safeguard if it overrides the arbitration clause in Section 9. She replied, and this time there was no laughter, no dismissive chuckle, only silence as one of the junior analysts reached forward almost instinctively, flipping through the pages with quick, uncertain movements, his eyes scanning, stopping, scanning again, and Ava continued, her voice steady even as her pulse pressed harder against her ribs. "The language allows retroactive interpretation under local jurisdiction, which means any dispute can be reclassified after the fact." And Sheikh Khalid's gaze did not leave her, but his hand moved, slowly, deliberately, turning the page himself, the gold edge of the paper catching the light as it shifted. And for a moment his pen rested against the margin, not writing, just touching, as if the decision was no longer automatic, while Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the smooth confidence he had carried into the room beginning to thin at the edges. "You are suggesting a scenario that is highly unlikely," he said, and now there was a slight edge beneath the polish, something sharper, less controlled, and Ava felt it, the pressure building, the unspoken warning that she had already gone too far, that one more step would cost her everything she had worked to keep, the job, the stability, the fragile sense of security she had built piece by piece. But the image of that clause remained clear in her mind, the structure of it, the way it folded into itself like a trap designed to look harmless until it was too late, and she took one small breath before speaking again. "It is not unlikely if it is intentional," she said, and that word hung there, intentional, heavier than anything else she had said, drawing a sharper reaction this time, a quiet intake of breath from someone near the far end of the table, a shift in Daniel's posture as he straightened, no longer leaning casually but sitting upright, his attention fully locked on her now. "That is a serious accusation," he said, his voice lower, firmer, and for the first time the room felt divided, not openly, not in any way that would be acknowledged, but in the subtle way people began to look at the document instead of at him, the way doubt crept in without permission, and Ava finally lifted her gaze from the contract to meet Sheikh Khalid's eyes directly, not challenging, not defiant, just clear. "You asked me to explain," she said softly, and then, without hesitation, she continued, this time not in English but in fluent, precise Arabic, the words flowing naturally, effortlessly, as if they had always belonged to her. "This clause gives them the power to redefine your obligations after you sign, and once you do, you cannot reverse it." And the effect was immediate, Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable, the kind of silence that deepens instead of breaks. Because now it was not just what she was saying, it was how she was saying it. The language, the clarity, the undeniable proof that she understood more than anyone had assumed. And Sheikh Khalid's expression shifted again. Not just attention now, but recognition, as if something about her no longer fit the narrow space they had placed her in, while Daniel's composure held for a second longer before cracking just enough to reveal the strain beneath. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, and this time it was not a dismissal, not a joke, but a question that carried something closer to concern, and Ava did not answer him, because the only answer that mattered was already in the room, written across the pages in front of them, waiting to be seen. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was difficult, but because it was no longer the right one to ask, and Ava could feel that shift as clearly as the weight of every eye in the room now fixed on her, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but searching, measuring, trying to reconcile the uniform she wore with the certainty in her voice. And she did not answer Daniel, not because she could not, but because answering him would pull the moment away from where it needed to stay, back into a place where status mattered more than truth. And instead she turned her attention to the contract again, stepping just 1 inch closer to the table, enough for her hand to hover above the page without touching it, her finger tracing the air above a paragraph as if the words themselves were too fragile to disturb. "It is not just one clause," she said, her tone steady, controlled. "It is how they connect." And that was when the room changed again, quieter this time, but sharper, as if everyone present realized that what they were witnessing was not a lucky guess or a bold interruption, but something far more precise, something structured. And Sheikh Khalid leaned forward slightly, his pen now set down entirely, forgotten against the polished surface, while one of the senior advisors reached for his glasses, sliding them on with a small, deliberate motion, the faint sound of the frames clicking into place echoing louder than expected in the stillness. "Show me," the Sheikh said, his voice low but unmistakably focused, and Ava nodded once, a small movement, controlled, before continuing. "Section 9 limits arbitration to your jurisdiction," she said, "but Section 17 overrides it under compliance review." And as she spoke, the analyst who had been flipping through the document earlier stopped, his finger landing exactly where she indicated, his eyes narrowing as he read more carefully this time, slower, more deliberate, and Ava continued without hesitation. "Then Section 22 allows them to redefine compliance based on future regulatory interpretations." And now the silence deepened, because the pattern was no longer abstract, no longer theoretical, it was visible, forming in real time across the page as each piece connected to the next. And Sheikh Khalid's gaze dropped to the document fully now, no longer watching her, but reading, really reading, his brow tightening just slightly as his eyes moved across the lines, while Daniel's composure shifted again, subtle but undeniable, his shoulders drawing back, his expression sharpening. "These are standard layered protections," he said, but the smooth confidence was no longer effortless. There was tension beneath it now, a controlled urgency that had not been there before, and Ava could hear it, could feel it, the difference between someone who believed in what they were saying and someone who needed others to believe it. "They are layered," she replied calmly, "but not for protection." And for the first time she let her finger lower just enough to tap lightly on the edge of the page, a soft, precise sound. "They are layered so no one notices how they interact." And that was when the analyst inhaled sharply, not loudly, but enough to draw attention, his posture shifting as he leaned closer. "Sir," he said carefully, addressing the Sheikh, "if these clauses are applied together, liability could indeed transfer entirely to us after execution." And the word indeed settled heavily, because it was no longer just her voice. It was confirmation, independent, professional, undeniable, and Sheikh Khalid did not respond immediately, his eyes still on the document, his fingers resting lightly against the paper as if grounding himself in the reality of what he was seeing, while Daniel leaned forward again, quicker now, his tone tightening. "We are wasting time on a misunderstanding," he said. "This deal has a limited window." And that phrase, limited window, hung in the air like a push, a subtle attempt to rush the moment forward before it could fully settle. But the Sheikh did not move, did not reach for his pen, did not acknowledge the urgency, and instead he turned one page back, then another, reviewing, confirming, the silence stretching longer with each second. And Ava felt her heartbeat again, steady, present, not racing, just there, a reminder that she was still standing in a room she was never meant to speak in, and yet everything in that room now hinged on what she had already said. And when Sheikh Khalid finally looked up, his gaze did not return to Daniel. It returned to her, sharper now, clearer, as if seeing her fully for the first time. "How much?" he asked. And the question was simple, but it carried weight, calculation, consequence, and Ava did not hesitate, because she had already done the math, already followed the structure of the agreement to its conclusion. $200 million, she said, her voice steady, unwavering, and full legal exposure beyond that. And this time the silence did not just hold, it deepened, because now the cost had a number, a shape, a reality that no one in the room could ignore. And somewhere near the far end of the table, a chair shifted, a quiet, almost involuntary reaction, while Daniel's expression stilled completely, the last trace of casual confidence gone, replaced by something far more rigid, controlled, and the room, once filled with certainty, now balanced on a single decision that had not yet been made. $200 million did not sound like a number anymore. It sounded like a line drawn across the room, separating what had been certain from what was now in question, and no one spoke because there was nothing casual left to say, not after the figure had been placed so plainly between them, and Ava could feel the shift settle into something heavier, something irreversible, the kind of silence that comes when a decision cannot be undone once it is made. And Sheikh Khalid remained still for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the document as if weighing not just the numbers but the intent behind them. The subtle design of it, the careful layering that had almost passed unnoticed. And then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, the leather giving a soft, controlled creak beneath him, his hand moving away from the paper entirely, leaving the pen behind as though it no longer belonged in his grasp, while Daniel Brooks exhaled through his nose, a measured breath that tried to reassert control over a situation that had begun to slip. "This is an overreaction," he said, his tone firm now, no longer softened by charm. "We have spent weeks negotiating this agreement, and we are allowing a misunderstanding from someone who is not even part of this process to derail it." And the words landed with intent, not loud, but pointed, aimed not just at Ava but at the authority she had been given in the past few minutes, an attempt to restore the natural order of the room, to remind everyone where she belonged, and Ava felt it. The familiar pressure of being reduced again, of being placed back into the narrow definition that made her easier to dismiss. But she did not respond, because this was no longer about proving herself. The evidence was already in front of them, written in ink, structured in clauses, waiting only to be acknowledged. And across the table one of the advisors cleared his throat softly, an almost hesitant sound. "Sir," he said to the Sheikh, choosing his words carefully, "we should pause and review this further." And that small suggestion carried more weight than any argument Daniel had made, because it was cautious, grounded, rooted in responsibility rather than persuasion. And Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly at that, the tension now visible in the way his fingers pressed together on the table, his control no longer effortless but maintained. "If we delay," he said, "the opportunity may not return." And there it was again, the urgency, the narrowing window, the push to move forward before doubt could take hold completely. But this time it did not land the same way, because the room had already changed, the certainty had already cracked, and Sheikh Khalid turned his head slightly, not toward Daniel, but toward Ava, his gaze steady, deliberate. "You said this was intentional," he said, his voice low, measured, and Ava nodded once, her posture still composed, her hands resting calmly at her sides. "Yes, sir," she replied, and for a brief second the weight of that acknowledgement settled deeper, because intention meant design, meant choice, meant that what they were looking at was not an accident or a misinterpretation, but something constructed. And Sheikh Khalid's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, in calculation, the kind that came from years of navigating decisions where trust and risk lived side by side. And then he did something that shifted the room entirely, something small, but decisive. He closed the folder, the soft sound of paper meeting paper echoing with finality across the table. And the motion itself said more than any words could have, because it removed the contract from immediate action, placed it out of reach, out of momentum, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, the deal was no longer moving forward, and Daniel's posture changed instantly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the loss of control, the slight forward lean replaced by a stillness that was too controlled to be natural. "That is unnecessary," he said, but the smoothness was gone now, replaced by something tighter, more contained, and Sheikh Khalid did not respond to the objection directly. Instead, he turned to his legal team, his voice calm but absolute. "I want a full review of every clause," he said. "Independent verification." And the instruction carried no room for negotiation, no space for urgency to override caution, and the advisors nodded, some more quickly than others, already gathering their notes, their focus shifting from closing the deal to understanding it, truly understanding it, while Daniel sat back, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper now, calculating, reassessing, and Ava felt the moment settle around her, the tension easing just slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because the immediate danger had passed. The signature had not been made, the decision had been paused, and yet she remained where she was, still standing at the edge of a table she was never meant to approach, her presence no longer invisible, but not fully accepted either, suspended between roles, between worlds. And for a brief moment she considered stepping back, returning to the service card, reclaiming the anonymity that had protected her for so long. But before she could move, Sheikh Khalid spoke again, his gaze returning to her with a clarity that left no doubt. "You," he said, and the single word held neither dismissal nor distance, only recognition. "Stay." And just like that, the line that had separated her from the room shifted once more, not erased, but redrawn in a way no one there had expected. The word "stay" did not echo loudly, but it settled into the room with a weight that shifted everything, because it was not a suggestion, not a courtesy, it was a decision, and Ava felt it before she even fully processed it. The subtle change in posture from the people around the table, the way no one looked toward the door anymore, the way her presence was no longer something to be corrected but something to be accounted for. And for a brief moment, she did not move, not out of hesitation, but because she understood that stepping forward now meant crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, and yet stepping back would undo everything that had just been set in motion. So she remained exactly where she was, balanced between those two choices, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her breathing steady, controlled, while Sheikh Khalid shifted his attention back to the table, his fingers lightly tapping once against the closed folder, not impatient, not uncertain, just marking the moment. "We proceed carefully," he said, his voice calm, final, and the advisors nodded, some already opening laptops, others pulling documents closer, their movements more deliberate now, stripped of the earlier confidence that had come from assumption rather than verification, and across from them Daniel Brooks watched in silence for a second longer before speaking again, his tone measured, restrained, but no longer carrying the same effortless authority. "If there are concerns," he said, "we can clarify the language right now." And the offer was strategic, precise, an attempt to regain ground, to keep the conversation within his control, but Sheikh Khalid did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted once more, not to the advisors, not to the document, but to Ava, and there was something different in it now, not just attention, not just recognition, but evaluation, as if he was placing her within a context that no longer matched the role she appeared to occupy. "What else did you see?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried expectation, an invitation that was also a test, and Ava felt the weight of it settle into her chest. Because this was no longer about a single clause, no longer about one moment of clarity. This was about stepping fully into a space she had never been given permission to enter. And for a brief second the room faded just slightly, not disappearing, but narrowing, the edges softening as her mind returned to the earlier hours of the day, to the quiet corner near the service station where the document had first been left unattended. The faint hum of the copier, the low murmur of staff moving through their routines, and the way her eyes had caught on a phrase that did not sit right, not because it was obvious, but because it was too clean, too carefully structured, and she let out a small breath before speaking, her voice steady as she stepped half an inch closer to the table. "The timeline," she said, and a few heads turned again, attention sharpening. "It is compressed in a way that benefits only one side." And Daniel's expression did not change, but there was a stillness to it now, a controlled focus that replaced the earlier ease, while Ava continued. "The compliance review period is set after execution, not before." And one of the advisors leaned forward, scrolling through a digital copy of the agreement, his eyes narrowing as he followed along. "Which means," she added, "any issues found cannot stop the deal, only shift the consequences." And the words landed quietly, but their implications spread quickly, visible in the way the advisors exchanged brief glances, not speaking, but understanding. And Sheikh Khalid's hand moved again, this time not toward the pen, but toward the folder, opening it once more with a slow, deliberate motion, as if the document itself had changed since the last time he looked at it. And Ava could feel the tension return, not as sharp as before, but deeper, more focused, because now they were not reacting. They were analyzing, and Daniel finally leaned forward again, his voice calm, but firmer than before. "Every agreement has structured timelines," he said. "That is not evidence of intent." And Ava met his gaze for the first time since he had questioned her. Not confrontational, not defiant, just clear. "Not by itself," she replied. "But combined with the liability structure, it removes your ability to respond before damage is done." And the room held that thought for a second, letting it settle, letting it connect with everything else that had already been revealed. And somewhere near the end of the table a quiet exhale slipped out, almost unnoticed, but it carried something new, something closer to realization than doubt. And Sheikh Khalid closed the folder again, this time more slowly, his hand resting on top of it, as if anchoring the decision he was about to make. And when he spoke, his voice was no longer weighing possibilities. It was defining direction. "We do not sign today," he said, and the words did not need emphasis. They carried their own finality. And just like that, the momentum of the deal stopped completely, not paused, not delayed, but redirected, and Daniel's expression stilled, every trace of persuasion gone, replaced by something quieter, more calculating, as if he was already considering what came next. While Ava remained where she stood, the room no longer pressing against her in the same way, but not fully welcoming either, suspended in that narrow space between being seen and being understood, and for the first time since she had spoken, she allowed herself a single, quiet breath, not of relief, but of recognition, because something had shifted beyond the contract, beyond the money, something that could not be written into clauses or negotiated across a table. And Sheikh Khalid's gaze returned to her once more, steady, deliberate. "You read this before," he said, and it was not a question. "Not exactly." But Ava nodded anyway, her voice soft, honest. "Yes, sir." And the room held that answer for a moment, because it carried its own weight, its own implications, and in that silence, the distance between who she was and what she had just done became impossible to ignore. The acknowledgement did not pass quietly. It settled into the room with a different kind of weight, one that did not come from numbers or clauses, but from implication, because reading a document like that, understanding it the way she had, was not something that fit neatly into the role printed on the small black name tag pinned to her uniform. And Ava could feel that realization moving through the room in subtle ways, in the way the advisors no longer glanced past her, but toward her, in the way the silence now held curiosity instead of dismissal. And Sheikh Khalid studied her for a moment longer, his gaze steady, not unkind, but precise, as if he was recalibrating everything he had assumed when she first entered the room carrying a tray instead of a briefcase. "Where did you learn to read contracts like this?" he asked, and the question was direct, but it carried no accusation, only intent, and Ava felt the shift in it, the difference between being questioned and being considered, and for a brief moment she hesitated. Not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer itself carried a weight she had learned to keep quiet, a part of her life that did not align with where she stood now. And the faint hum of the room returned around her, the soft tapping of keys as someone began taking notes, the distant sound of an elevator bell somewhere beyond the glass walls, all of it grounding her back into the present, and she let out a small breath before speaking. "I studied finance," she said, her voice calm, even, and a few of the advisors exchanged quick glances at that. Subtle but noticeable. While Sheikh Khalid's expression remained focused. "Where?" he asked, and Ava met his gaze, steady, without hesitation now. "Howard University," she replied, and the name settled into the room with a quiet significance, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to shift the context again, because it carried credibility, history, something that could not be dismissed as easily as the uniform she wore. And Daniel Brooks leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he absorbed that, recalculating, reassessing, while Ava continued, not to justify, not to explain, but simply to complete the truth. "I did not finish," she added, and that detail hung there as well, softer, but just as real, and Sheikh Khalid's gaze did not waver. "Why not?" he asked, and there was no judgment in it, only a quiet expectation of honesty, and Ava paused for a second, the memory surfacing clearly, not painful, not dramatic, just present, like something she had carried long enough that it no longer needed explanation. "My mother got sick," she said, her tone unchanged. "I came home. And that was all. No elaboration, no added detail, just the simple truth, and the room absorbed it in silence. Not because it was surprising, but because it was human, grounding the moment in something beyond contracts and negotiations. And for a brief second no one spoke, the tension shifting into something quieter, more reflective, before Sheikh Khalid gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, acknowledging not just the answer but the person behind it. And then his attention moved back to the table, to the document that had started all of this. "You said the structure was intentional," he said, bringing the focus back with precision, and Ava nodded once, her posture still composed. "Yes, sir," she replied, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table now, no longer distant from the decision in front of him. "Then tell me," he said, his voice low, deliberate, "what you think their endgame is." And the question shifted the room again, because it was no longer about identifying a problem, it was about understanding motive, about seeing beyond the surface into the design beneath it. And Ava felt the weight of that, the shift from observation to interpretation, and for a moment she looked down at the contract again, the lines, the structure, the way everything connected, and she spoke carefully, not guessing, not assuming, but following the logic she had already traced. "They do not expect you to lose immediately," she said, and a few of the advisors leaned in slightly, listening more closely now. "They expect the deal to hold long enough that the liabilities become yours." And Daniel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at that, his composure still intact but no longer effortless, and Ava continued, her voice steady. "Once that happens, they can exit cleanly while your company absorbs the fallout." And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, and Sheikh Khalid's fingers tapped once lightly against the table, a small, controlled motion that marked the thought as it landed, while the advisors exchanged another series of brief, silent glances, the kind that carried agreement without needing words, and Daniel remained still, his gaze fixed on the table now, not avoiding, but calculating, measuring what could still be recovered from a situation that had shifted beyond his control. And Ava felt the moment settle again, deeper this time, because what had begun as a single interruption had now unfolded into something far more significant, something that could not be dismissed or undone. And for the first time since she had spoken, the room did not feel like a place she did not belong, but a place that had not yet decided where to place her, suspended between the role she had walked in with and the one she had just revealed. And in that quiet, Sheikh Khalid leaned back once more, his gaze moving from the document to Ava, steady, thoughtful. "You saw all of this," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of recognition. And Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, certain. "Yes, sir." And the silence that followed was no longer about doubt. It was about what would happen next. The silence did not break immediately after her answer. It deepened, settling into something heavier than uncertainty, something closer to realization. Because now the room was no longer questioning whether she was right. It was beginning to understand what being right actually meant, and Ava could feel that shift in the way no one rushed to speak, in the way even Daniel Brooks remained still, his usual rhythm of control disrupted, replaced by a quiet calculation that did not quite hide the tension in his jaw. And Sheikh Khalid let the moment stretch just long enough for it to settle fully before he moved, his hand reaching for the glass of water in front of him, lifting it slowly, the faint clink of ice against crystal breaking the silence, just enough to remind everyone that time was still moving forward, even if the deal was not. And he took a small sip, deliberate, measured, before setting the glass back down with care, his gaze shifting not to Ava this time, but directly to Daniel. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone now, not questioning, not exploratory, but controlled and precise. "You said this structure was standard," he said, and Daniel nodded once. Immediately, almost too quickly. He replied, his voice steady, though the ease had not fully returned. "These are common protections in complex international agreements." And Sheikh Khalid's fingers tapped once lightly against the table, the motion subtle but intentional. "Then explain why they align so perfectly to remove my protection," he said, and the question did not rise, did not push. It simply landed, and the room held it, because it did not leave much space for interpretation, and Daniel paused for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to be noticed, before leaning forward slightly, his hands clasping together on the table. "You are looking at them in isolation," he said, "when they are designed to function as part of a broader framework." And Ava could feel the shift in his strategy, the attempt to reframe, to expand the context until the specifics blurred. But this time the room did not follow as easily, because the specifics had already been made visible, and one of the advisors spoke up, his voice careful, measured. "With respect, the interaction between these clauses is not typical," he said, and that quiet reinforcement landed heavier than any challenge, because it came from within the structure Daniel had relied on, and Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward him, then back to the Sheikh, his expression tightening just slightly. "Every deal has unique elements," he replied, and there was a faint edge beneath the words now, controlled, but present, and Ava remained still, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her gaze steady, not interjecting, not pushing, because she understood something had shifted beyond her. The conversation no longer needed her voice to continue. The truth was already moving on its own, and Sheikh Khalid leaned back once more, his posture relaxed but not casual, the kind of stillness that comes from clarity rather than hesitation. "Unique does not mean unbalanced," he said, and the sentence landed clean, without force, without emphasis. But it carried a finality that closed the space Daniel had been trying to reopen, and for a moment no one spoke again, the weight of that distinction settling into the room, while Daniel's composure held, but only just, the edges of it visible now in the slight tension of his shoulders, the controlled stillness of his hands. And Ava watched quietly as the dynamic shifted further, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, undeniable ways. In the way the advisors now leaned toward the Sheikh rather than Daniel, in the way their focus remained on the document rather than the explanation, and in that subtle shift the authority in the room began to realign, not away from power, but toward clarity, and Sheikh Khalid's gaze moved once more, returning to Ava, not as an afterthought, not as an interruption, but as part of the conversation itself. "If you had not spoken," he said, his voice low, thoughtful, "we would have signed." And the statement was simple, but it carried weight, not just in what it acknowledged, but in what it implied, and Ava felt it settle into her chest, not as pride, not as relief, but as something quieter, a recognition of the thin line she had stepped across, and she gave a small nod, her voice soft but steady. "Yes, sir," she said, and the room held that truth for a moment, because it was not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real, and Sheikh Khalid's fingers rested lightly on the closed folder once more, his gaze shifting back to Daniel, steady, unhurried. "We will not proceed," he said, and this time there was no room left for negotiation, no space for urgency to push against it. The decision was complete, and Daniel did not respond immediately, his expression still composed, but the calculation behind it now more visible, as if he was already moving on to whatever came next, whatever could still be salvaged, while Ava remained where she stood. The room no longer pressing against her, no longer trying to place her back into the role she had stepped out of, but not fully settled either, suspended in that space where something had changed but had not yet been defined, and in the quiet that followed, the deal that had once seemed inevitable now felt distant, almost unreal, like something that had nearly happened but had been stopped just in time, not by power, not by position, but by a voice that had not been expected to matter, and for the first time since the meeting began, the room felt different, not quieter, not louder, but clearer, as if something unseen had finally been brought into the light. The decision settled over the room like a line drawn in ink, clean and irreversible, and for a moment no one moved because there was nothing left to negotiate, no angle left to soften it, and Ava felt the stillness shift into something quieter, something more deliberate, as if the room itself was recalibrating around a new center of gravity, and Daniel Brooks sat back slowly in his chair, the motion controlled, measured, but no longer carrying the quiet dominance he had entered with, his fingers resting against the edge of the table as if grounding himself, his eyes flicking briefly to the closed folder before returning to Sheikh. "Then I assume we are done here," he said, and his tone was steady, composed, but stripped of persuasion, stripped of the urgency that had driven him only minutes before, and Sheikh did not respond immediately, his gaze lingering on the contract for one more second before shifting to the advisors around him. "We are done with this version," he said, and the distinction was subtle, but it carried weight, because it left the door open. Just enough to signal that the relationship itself was not being dismissed, only the terms, and Daniel caught that, the slight narrowing of his eyes revealing that he understood the implication, that the negotiation had not ended, only the balance of it had changed, and he gave a small nod, once, controlled, before reaching for his briefcase, the soft click of the latch breaking the silence again, and as he gathered his documents, the room began to move, not all at once, but in small, quiet shifts, laptops closing, papers sliding into folders, the subtle choreography of a meeting ending without resolution, and Ava remained where she was, still standing just beyond the edge of the table, her presence no longer questioned but not fully addressed either, as if the room had not yet decided what to do with the space she now occupied, and for a brief moment she considered stepping back, returning to the cart, finishing the task she had been assigned before any of this had happened, but something in the stillness held her there, something unspoken, unresolved, and Sheikh noticed it, his gaze returning to her once more, steady, thoughtful. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, carried a different weight now, not a formality, not a courtesy, but a recognition that had been earned rather than given, and Ava met his gaze, her voice calm, clear. "Ava Carter," she said, and he nodded once, the motion small but deliberate, as if committing it to memory. "Miss Carter," he said, and the use of her name shifted something again, subtle but undeniable, placing her within the conversation rather than outside it. And for a second the room held that change, the way titles and acknowledgement could redraw boundaries without raising a voice. And one of the advisors glanced toward her, then back to the Sheikh, as if waiting for direction, and Sheikh leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "You said you studied finance," he said, and Ava nodded once. "Yes, sir." And he held her gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "Then you understand what nearly happened here." And it was not a question, but Ava answered anyway, her voice steady. "Yes, sir." And he leaned back, the leather chair giving a soft sound beneath him, his expression thoughtful, measured, as if weighing something beyond the contract, beyond the numbers, something that did not appear in any clause, and Daniel, now standing with his briefcase in hand, paused for a fraction of a second, his attention shifting back to the exchange, his expression unreadable but focused, as if recognizing that whatever was about to follow mattered more than the deal he had just lost, and the room quieted again, not out of tension this time, but out of anticipation, and Sheikh gaze remained on Ava, steady, deliberate. "You saw what my team did not," he said, and the statement carried no criticism, no accusation, only clarity, and Ava did not look away, did not lower her eyes. She simply answered, "I read it carefully." And the simplicity of it settled into the room with a quiet weight, because it was not about brilliance or luck, it was about attention, about taking the time to see what others assumed was already understood, and for a moment no one spoke, the truth of that hanging in the air, and then Sheikh Khalid gave a small nod, almost to himself, before speaking again, his voice calm but decisive. "That matters," he said, and the words were not loud, not emphasized, but they carried something deeper than approval, something closer to acknowledgement, and Ava felt it, not as validation, not as relief, but as a shift in how she was being seen, not as a role, not as a uniform, but as a person who had made a difference in a room where she was never meant to speak. And as the meeting began to dissolve fully, chairs sliding back, quiet conversations starting in low voices, Ava finally stepped back half a step, not retreating, not disappearing, but adjusting, finding her place again in a space that had changed around her. And in that moment, as the glass walls reflected the movement of the room, the light catching on polished surfaces and still water in untouched glasses, something remained that had not been there before, not written in any document, not negotiated across the table, but present all the same, the quiet recognition that the smallest voice in the room had been the one that mattered most. The room did not return to what it had been before, even as people began to move, because something in its structure had shifted in a way that could not be reset, and Ava felt that difference in the air as clearly as the faint chill from the glass walls, the kind of cool that came from height and sealed windows and controlled environments. And yet beneath it there was something warmer now, quieter, less rigid, and she stepped back another inch, not out of retreat, but out of instinct, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the service cart as if grounding herself in something familiar, something that still made sense, while around her the meeting dissolved into low voices and measured movements, advisors speaking in controlled tones, laptops closing with soft clicks, the rhythm of business continuing but altered, redirected, and Daniel Brooks remained where he stood for a moment longer than the others, his briefcase in hand, his gaze moving once more across the table, across the faces that had shifted away from him, and finally, briefly, toward Ava, not dismissive, not mocking, but assessing, as if recalculating a variable he had not accounted for. And then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before turning toward the door, the polished floor catching the reflection of his movement as he walked out without another word. And the quiet sound of the door closing behind him marked the end of something, not just the deal, but the certainty that had carried it forward, and Ava watched that moment without expression, not out of indifference, but because she understood that what had just happened would not fully settle until much later, when the room was empty and the echoes of it had faded. And for now, everything remained suspended in that space between action and understanding, and she reached for the tray again, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal edge, the familiar weight steady in her hands, a reminder of where she had started only minutes ago, before a single sentence had changed the direction of everything. And as she turned slightly, preparing to step away, Sheikh Khalid's voice stopped her again, not sharply, not loudly, but with a clarity that carried across the room without effort. "Miss Carter," he said, and Ava paused, her movement halting mid-step, the tray still in her hands, and she turned back, meeting his gaze once more, and there was something different in his expression now, not just recognition, not just evaluation, but a kind of quiet decision forming beneath it, and the advisors nearby fell silent again, not because they had been told to, but because they sensed it, the shift in focus, the moment that was about to define what came next. And Sheikh Khalid rested his hands lightly on the table, his posture relaxed but intentional. "Do you plan to return to school?" he asked, and the question was unexpected, not connected to the contract, not tied to the deal. And for a second Ava simply looked at him, processing it, because it did not belong to the world of the last hour. It belonged to something else entirely, something more personal, more uncertain, and she answered honestly, her voice steady but softer now. "I would like to," she said, and the room held that answer differently than the others, not as a fact to be verified, but as something to be understood, and Sheikh Khalid nodded once, his gaze steady. "You should," he said. and the simplicity of it carried weight, not as advice, not as instruction, but as recognition of potential, and Ava felt that settle into her chest in a way that was harder to define, not immediate, not overwhelming, just present, like something being placed gently into her hands without being forced. And one of the advisors shifted slightly, glancing between them, as if waiting for something more formal, something structured, but chic. Khalid did not rush, did not turn the moment into an announcement or a decision. He simply held it there for a second longer, allowing it to exist without pressure, and then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small card, plain, understated, and he placed it on the table in front of him, sliding it forward just enough that it caught the light, the edges sharp against the polished surface. "If you decide to," he said, his voice calm, "even, call that number," and Ava's eyes moved to the card, not immediately stepping forward, not immediately reaching for it, because the weight of it was not in the paper itself, but in what it represented, a door, an option, something that had not existed for her before this moment. And the room remained quiet as she took a single step forward, setting the tray down once more with careful precision, the soft sound of metal against glass echoing faintly. And then she reached out, her fingers closing gently around the card, the texture smooth beneath her touch, and for a brief second she looked at it, not reading it yet, just holding it, feeling the reality of it settle in, before lifting her gaze back to meet his. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just clear, and Sheikh Khalid gave a small nod in return, the exchange simple, but complete, and around them the room began to move again. The moment passing without announcement, without ceremony, but leaving something behind that could not be undone, and Ava picked up the tray once more, the weight familiar, unchanged, and yet everything else around it had shifted, the light reflecting differently, the silence carrying a different meaning, and as she turned toward the service door, the card resting lightly in her hand, she understood something quietly, something that did not need to be spoken, that the moment she had stepped into had not just changed the outcome of a deal, it had changed the direction of her own path, in a way that would only become clear long after the room returned to silence. The card felt lighter than it should have as Ava held it between her fingers, the edges smooth, the weight almost nothing, and yet it carried more gravity than anything else she had touched in that room, and she did not look down at it again as she turned toward the service door, because she knew that if she did, even for a second, the moment might feel too real, too fragile, like something that could disappear if examined too closely. And instead she focused on the familiar rhythm of movement, the quiet push of the door as it opened into the service corridor, the shift in temperature, the air slightly warmer, less filtered, carrying the faint scent of cleaning solution and coffee. From somewhere down the hall, and behind her the conference room remained active, voices low, controlled, already transitioning into the next phase of decisions that no longer included the contract she had just stopped. And as the door closed softly behind her, the sound sealed the space, separating what had happened from the rest of the building, and Ava paused for just a second in the hallway, the tray still balanced in one hand, the card in the other, her breath steady, her posture unchanged. And yet something inside her had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, like a line that had been crossed not outwardly, but internally, and she slipped the card carefully into the pocket of her uniform, not as a gesture of doubt, but as a choice to hold it without letting it define her immediately. And then she moved, continuing down the corridor with the same measured steps she had always used, the same steady pace, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. And further down the hall another staff member passed her, offering a quick glance and a small nod, unaware of what had just taken place one floor above, unaware that the routine of the day had been altered in a way that would never appear on any schedule or report, and Ava nodded back, her expression calm, unchanged, because outwardly there was no reason for anything to be different. And yet as she reached the service station and set the tray down, the soft clink of glass against metal echoing lightly, her hand lingered there for a fraction of a second longer than usual, her fingers resting against the edge as if anchoring herself to something familiar, something steady, and she let out a small breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to release the tension that had built without her fully noticing it. and behind her the elevator chimed softly, the doors opening and closing as people moved through their own separate moments, each carrying their own concerns, their own decisions, none of them aware of how close something significant had come to unfolding just a few floors above. And Ava turned slightly, reaching for a clean cloth, continuing her work with the same quiet precision, wiping down the surface in smooth, practiced motions, the rhythm grounding, consistent, and yet her mind did not return fully to routine. It hovered just beneath it, holding onto the memory of the room, the silence, the shift in voices, the moment when everything had paused because of something she had said, and it did not feel like triumph. It did not feel like victory. It felt like clarity, like something that had always been there, but had not been given space until now. And as she worked, the reflection of her movement faintly visible in the polished surface, she caught a glimpse of herself. The uniform, the name tag, the same image that had walked into the room earlier. And yet it did not look quite the same anymore, not because it had changed, but because what it represented no longer felt as fixed as it had before, and somewhere above, behind closed doors, decisions were being made, reviews being ordered, processes being adjusted, all of it moving forward without her. And that was expected, that was natural, and she did not feel the need to follow it, to insert herself into that world, because she had already done what needed to be done. And as the minutes passed, the building returned to its usual rhythm, the quiet hum of operations continuing without interruption, the moment already fading into something that would only be fully understood later. And yet the card remained in her pocket, a small, silent presence, not demanding attention, not pulling her away from where she stood, but existing as a possibility, a direction that had not been there before. And Ava finished wiping the surface, setting the cloth aside with care, her movements steady, controlled, and for a brief second she allowed herself to stand still, just long enough to feel the weight of that possibility settle into place. Not overwhelming, not urgent, just present. And then she picked up the tray again, turning back toward the hallway, ready to continue her shift, her steps as measured as ever, even as the path ahead of her had quietly begun to change. The rest of the shift moved the way shifts always did, measured in small tasks and quiet transitions, in the soft rhythm of footsteps along carpeted hallways and the distant hum of conversations that never quite reached full volume. And Ava stayed within that rhythm, moving from one room to another with the same steady precision, the same practiced awareness of space and timing, her presence blending into the background as it always had. And yet there was a difference now, not in what she did, but in how it felt, because the silence around her no longer pressed in the same way. It did not carry the same weight of invisibility, and every so often her fingers brushed lightly against the pocket where the card rested, not checking, not confirming, just acknowledging that it was there, a quiet reminder that something had shifted. And as the afternoon stretched into early evening, the light outside the tall windows softened, the city below turning from sharp lines into a slower glow, the reflections inside the building growing warmer, more diffuse. And Ava found herself pausing for just a second longer than usual near one of those windows, the tray balanced against her hip as she looked out over the grid of streets far below, the movement of traffic reduced to slow, distant patterns. And for a moment everything felt still, not because nothing was happening, but because she was allowing herself to stand in it, to recognize the space she was in without rushing past it. And then the moment passed, as it always did, and she moved again, returning to the quiet flow of work, until the end of her shift approached almost without notice. The gradual clearing of rooms, the lowering of voices, the subtle signs that the day was closing. And when she finally returned to the service area for the last time, setting down the tray with a soft, controlled motion, she let her hand rest there again for a brief second, feeling the cool surface beneath her fingers, grounding herself one more time before stepping away. And she reached into her pocket then, not hurried, not uncertain, but deliberate, pulling out the card and holding it in her hand, turning it slightly so the light caught the edges. And for the first time she looked at it fully, reading the name, the number, the simple design that carried more possibility than anything else she had been given in years. And her expression did not change dramatically. There was no sudden shift, no visible reaction, just a quiet focus as she took it in, and the sounds around her continued, someone closing a cabinet, another staff member laughing softly at something down the hall, the ordinary life of the building moving forward without pause. And Ava slipped the card back into her pocket with the same care, not out of hesitation, but because she understood that whatever it represented did not need to be decided in this moment. It could wait. It could exist alongside everything else until she was ready to act on it. And as she gathered her things, folding her apron neatly, placing it where it belonged, her movements remained calm, controlled, the same as they had always been, and yet beneath that there was a subtle shift, a sense of alignment that had not been there before, as if something inside her had settled into place, not changing who she was, but clarifying it. And when she finally stepped out of the service corridor and into the main hallway, the space felt different, not because it had changed, but because she was seeing it differently. The polished floors, the quiet lighting, the reflections in the glass, all of it familiar, and yet not quite the same, and she walked toward the elevator with steady steps. Her posture relaxed but intentional, her gaze forward, and when the doors opened with a soft chime, she stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflecting her image back at her, the uniform, the name tag, the same visual she had seen countless times before, and she looked at it for a second, not critically, not questioning, just observing. And then the doors closed, the elevator beginning its smooth descent. The gentle shift in motion barely noticeable, and Ava stood there quietly, one hand resting lightly at her side, the other brushing once more against the pocket where the card rested. And she did not smile, she did not frown, she simply stood in that moment, present, aware, and as the numbers above the door changed one by one, marking the distance between where she had been and where she was going, she understood something quietly, something that did not need to be spoken, that the path ahead of her had not suddenly become easy or certain, but it had become visible in a way it had not been before. And when the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened again, she stepped out into the evening, the air different, less controlled, carrying the sounds of the city, and she moved forward without hesitation, her pace steady, her direction clear, even if the destination had not yet been fully defined. The evening air felt different the moment Ava stepped onto the sidewalk, not colder, not warmer, just real in a way the filtered air of the building never was, carrying the layered sounds of the city, distant traffic, footsteps passing, the low murmur of conversations blending into a steady hum that did not demand attention but filled the space all the same. And she paused for a second just outside the glass doors, the reflection of the lobby lights behind her fading as she moved forward, her shoes meeting the pavement with quiet, steady steps. And for a moment she simply walked without thinking, letting the rhythm of movement settle into her body, the familiar route toward the bus stop unfolding ahead of her. The same path she had taken countless times before, and yet nothing about it felt exactly the same, not because the street had changed, but because something inside her had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a lens that had been adjusted just enough to bring things into clearer focus. And her hand brushed lightly against her pocket again, feeling the outline of the card through the fabric, not pulling it out, not checking, just acknowledging it. A small, quiet presence that had followed her out into the world beyond the building. And she continued walking, passing storefronts with lights beginning to dim, reflections stretching across glass, the city transitioning from day into evening without pause. And as she reached the corner, waiting for the light to change, she allowed herself to stop fully for the first time since leaving the building. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, her gaze lifting slightly as she looked across the street, not searching for anything specific, just taking in the space. And in that stillness the events of the day began to settle differently, not as a sequence of moments, but as something connected, something that had unfolded because she had chosen to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. And she did not replay it in detail, did not analyze every word or reaction. She simply recognized it for what it was, a moment that had required something from her, and she had given it without hesitation. And the light changed, the signal shifting from red to white, and she stepped forward again, crossing the street with the same measured pace, her steps steady, her posture unchanged. And on the other side she slowed slightly, not stopping, just adjusting, as if allowing herself a fraction more time to consider what came next. And her hand moved again, this time slipping into her pocket, her fingers closing around the card, feeling its edges, its shape, and she pulled it out, holding it in her hand as she walked. The streetlights catching the surface just enough to make the printed text visible, and she looked at it again, not quickly, not casually, but with quiet attention, reading the name, the number, the simplicity of it, and for a moment she imagined what it represented, not in broad terms, not as something overwhelming, but in small, practical ways, a phone call, a conversation, a step that would lead to another, and she felt no pressure in it, no urgency, just possibility, something open rather than demanding. And she slowed again near the bus stop, the bench half occupied, the soft glow of the overhead light casting long shadows across the pavement, and she stood there, the card still in her hand, her thumb resting lightly against its edge, and for a second she considered putting it away again, returning it to her pocket, letting it remain there until another time, but instead she kept it where it was, not as a decision, not as a commitment, but as an acknowledgement that this moment mattered, that it was not something to be set aside without thought. And the bus arrived with a low mechanical hum, the doors opening with a soft hiss, and Ava stepped forward, climbing the steps with the same quiet confidence she had carried all day, the driver giving a brief nod as she passed, and she returned it, her expression calm, unchanged, and she moved down the aisle, finding a seat near the window, sitting. With a small, controlled motion, the card still in her hand, and as the bus pulled away from the curb, the city outside shifting slowly past the glass, lights stretching into lines of motion, she looked at the card one more time, then turned it over once, as if confirming that it was real, that it had not changed since she first held it, and then she slipped it back into her pocket, her hand resting there for a second longer. And as the bus continued forward, the steady vibration beneath her feet, the quiet murmur of other passengers around her, she allowed herself to lean back slightly, her gaze moving to the window, watching the city pass by, and in that movement, in that quiet space between where she had been and where she was going, she made a decision, not spoken, not dramatic, just clear, that when the time came, she would use that card, not because it had been offered, but because she had earned it, and the thought settled into her with a calm certainty, not changing her pace, not altering her expression, but aligning something deeper, something that had been waiting for the right moment to take shape. And as the bus carried her further into the evening, the city lights reflecting softly in the glass, Ava sat quietly, present, aware, her path no longer hidden, just waiting for her to take the next step. The bus moved steadily through the city, each stop marked by a soft hiss of doors and the quiet exchange of passengers stepping in and out, their lives intersecting for only a moment before continuing in separate directions, and Ava remained by the window, her reflection faintly visible against the dark glass, layered over the passing lights that stretched and blurred with motion, and she did not look at her phone, did not shift restlessly in her seat. She simply sat there, present, her posture relaxed but grounded, her hand resting lightly against her pocket where the card remained. And as the minutes passed, the noise of the day settled into something quieter, something more distant, not forgotten, but integrated, like a piece of music that no longer needed to be played out loud to be heard. And she thought briefly of the conference room, of the stillness, of the moment when a single sentence had shifted everything, and it did not replay as tension or pressure, it returned as clarity, as a reminder of something simple and steady, that she had seen what others had overlooked because she had taken the time to look, truly look, and that realization did not feel like something new. It felt like something she had always known, but had not always been allowed to act on. And the bus slowed as it approached her stop, the familiar corner coming into view, the streetlights casting a soft amber glow across the pavement, and she pressed the signal button with a quiet, controlled motion, the small chime echoing briefly before fading. And when the bus came to a stop, she stood, her movements smooth, unhurried, stepping into the aisle and toward the door, the same way she had done so many times before, and yet this time there was a subtle difference, not visible, not dramatic, just present in the way she carried herself, in the quiet alignment between who she was and what she had done. And she stepped down onto the sidewalk, the air cooler now, the sounds of the city softer in this part of the neighborhood, and she began walking the short distance toward her building, her steps steady, the rhythm familiar, and as she reached the entrance, she paused for just a second, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, not hesitating, just acknowledging the moment, the transition from one space to another, and then she stepped inside. The hallway dimly lit, the quiet of the building wrapping around her as she moved toward the stairs, choosing them over the elevator without thought, her footsteps soft against the worn steps, each one carrying her upward at a steady pace. And when she reached her floor, she moved down the hallway, unlocking her door with a small, practiced motion, the click of the lock sounding louder in the quiet space, and she stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her, the sound sealing off the outside world. And for a moment she stood there, just inside the entryway, her bag resting against her shoulder, the room around her still, familiar, unchanged, and she let out a small breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to mark the end of the day, and she set her bag down, moving through the space with quiet ease, turning on a small lamp, the warm light filling the room softly, and then she reached into her pocket, pulling out the card once more, holding it in her hand as she walked to the small table near the window, and she placed it there, not tucked away, not hidden, but visible, resting flat against the surface where the light could catch it, and she looked at it for a moment, her gaze steady, not searching for meaning, not questioning its value, just acknowledging it as part of what came next, and then she stepped back, moving toward the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, the simple action grounding, familiar, and as she took a sip, she glanced back toward the table, the card still there, unchanged, waiting, and she did not rush toward it, did not pick it up again, because she understood something now that she had not fully seen before, that the moment in the conference room had not given her something she did not already have, it had revealed it, had placed it in a space where it could no longer be ignored, and that mattered more than any opportunity that might come from it. And she set the glass down, the soft sound marking the quiet of the room, and she moved to the window, looking out over the street below, the same view she had seen every evening, the same pattern of lights and movement, and yet it felt different now, not because the world had changed, but because she had, in a way that did not require explanation, and as she stood there, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, layered over the city beyond, she understood something clearly, something that settled into her with quiet certainty, that she did not need to become someone else to step forward. She only needed to continue being who she had already proven herself to be, and the thought did not rush her, did not push her into action. It simply stayed with her, steady, grounded, and after a moment she turned away from the window, the room warm and quiet around her, the card resting on the table, the next step waiting, and she moved forward into the space, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the calm understanding that whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she had met everything that had brought her here, with clarity, with steadiness, and with a voice that no longer needed permission to be heard.